Hello, and welcome back to Later Global Cultures. I'm Professor Amy Young, and today we're going to discuss all of the myriad impacts and expressions that make up the Baroque era. What seems to be prevalent here, though, is that he who has the power directs expression. And that got me wondering, how does power speak to us today? There's the obvious rhetoric of politicians and influencers, but what about advertising and entertainment? Are they speaking for power too? How are they trying to engage us or tell us our value? And how much of what we value is shaped by them without us even realizing it? Do they tell us what's important, what to love, what to fear, what to respect, and what to desire? Do you see yourself in the expression all around you? And if you don't, how does the expression all around you still shape your worldview? Here in the Baroque era and elsewhere, it's important to consider what messages artistic expression is trying to convey, and more importantly, to what end. What are you supposed to feel, and who benefits from you feeling that way? Today, we'll dive into an understanding of the historical and philosophical context of the Counter-Reformation and the Baroque era, along with who art is for and what it's trying to achieve. And in this exploration, we'll also work to identify the styles and techniques of Baroque arts, literature, and music in service of these aims. So here we are in the 17th century, the home of the Baroque era. In the 1500s, we saw some of the early-ish impacts of the Protestant Reformation and their impact on those superstructures that were waning because of the religious movement. And as you can imagine, the Holy Roman Empire and the Catholic Church, as well as those countries that supported them, were in a state of flux, and there were lots of up-and-coming powers that were ready to challenge their authority, especially after Luther's example. Because of this struggle to gain or regain control, the Baroque era is also sometimes called the Age of Absolutionism. The Church and many powerful imperial and monarchical powers are trying to assert an absolute authority, and it doesn't always go well. First of all, the Holy Roman Empire has a hard time asserting control over an area that is both geographically and ideologically divided. In the 30 Years' War, Northern Protestants demand religious rights from Catholic rulers, and in an effort to suppress this, the Holy Roman Empire, led by Charles V, fights religious battles in the name of the Catholic Church and in his authority as sovereign ruler of the ailing imperial power. Then, what started as a war between Catholics and Protestants gets political as countries vie for control. Plus, elsewhere, Charles V is also dealing with an old feud between Spain and France. Charles is Spanish, so even though all of these Catholic countries are struggling to deal with Protestants at the same time, they aren't really making a group effort of it. Instead, these rulers are exerting their power by claiming that they rule by divine right. We already saw Henry VIII make himself the head of the church and the ultimate religious authority in England, and in France, Louis XIV also invokes the divine right of kings, or the idea that his power comes directly from God. The problem is that for Louis, this meant that he was responsible only to God, not to the people. Then, England, even though it was Protestant, wasn't free from troubles either. Their parliament and the monarchy are at odds, and this leads up to a civil war that we'll discuss more when we cover the Enlightenment. Oh, and Spain is making a name for itself as an imperial state and bringing home all sorts of money from adventures in the Americas. And while this ought to give Charles V a big name and big control to go with his big money, the wars at home and in Europe use up that cash pretty quickly. So Spain's economic problems undermine his authority too. One place, however, that manages to break free of this struggle is Holland. Holland is able to hold off Spain and maintain its independence. And eventually it becomes the leading trading nation in the Western world as the East India Company, a Dutch trading powerhouse, becomes the #1 trading company between Europe and India. In the end, even though these Catholic countries are sometimes battling each other, they all agree that something needs to be done about the Protestant problem. Charles eventually calls a truce between Spain and France, and they ask the Church to get the official word out about the Catholic Church's stance on Protestantism. This leads to the Counter-Reformation, wherein the Catholic Church responds to Protestant accusations and makes some reforms of its own. All of this goes down at the Council of Trent. The council sounds like it was one really productive meeting, but it was actually 3 meetings that spanned 3 popes and about 80 years. The goals of the Council of Trent were to examine Catholic practice and see where they needed to address issues of corruption, as well as respond to the Protestant accusations. In the end, though, they mostly did a lot of work affirming Catholic doctrine and dogma. As you may know, Catholicism is built on ritual, sacrament, and tradition, and the Council of Trent justified sacraments as acts of faith that were needed for salvation. So, according to the Council, salvation was not based on faith alone, as Martin Luther had claimed. Additionally, the Council asserted that later teachings of the Catholic Church were not worthless either, and they affirmed the need for celibacy for the clergy and the belief in purgatory as necessities for the proper practice and understanding of Christianity. They did, however, also acknowledge some shortcomings, and this led to a call for renewed discipline for church leaders as well as education for those preaching and teaching Christianity. So, no more making up the doctrine, and priests in front of populations needed to understand the faith. Bishops who had been hanging out in Rome were sent home to the regions they represented, and they were told to crack the whip and make sure that God's representatives on earth were not abusing their positions. Also, and perhaps most importantly, as far as Luther was concerned, the sale of indulgences or any other church favors was strictly prohibited. A lot of the impetus for this change came out of Spain, where they already had some systems in place to reform and reaffirm the Catholic Church. One such system was the Order of the Jesuits, or the Society of Jesus, and the guy at the head of this was Ignatius Loyola. Loyola was a soldier in Charles's army. He was wounded there, and while wounded, he turned to religion, and he got pretty hardcore. He meditated in a cave while working out his spiritual exercises, and these resulted in mystical experiences. In case you don't know, mysticism is the union of the soul with God through contemplation and love, and there are a number of saints who contemplated and or meditated upon Jesus and God so fervently that they found a mystical union with the divine, or felt the Holy Spirit. This union for them was attained through simplicity and piety or extreme devotion, and in some places it was controversial because it did not require folks to go through a priest to partake of any sacraments. In other places, however, it was encouraged as a more intuitive and personal faith. Ignatius Loyola's mystical experiences were in large part driven by his desire to distinguish between good and evil spirits in the real world. And he got there through discipline, prayer, meditation, and then he shared these ideas with his new religious order. And even though they came along a little before the Council of Trent, eventually the Jesuits were a great resource in defending the Catholic faith and the aims of the Counter-Reformation. The Jesuits promoted the teachings of the Church in a somewhat militaristic fashion, likely owing something to Loyola's military background, and they were also missionaries who supported educational improvement and church doctrine and dogma. They traveled far and wide and spoke a number of languages, and they delivered the message of the Church to lay people as well as those who might be converted to Christianity. In the end, they staved off Protestantism in parts of Germany and in France, and there were also Jesuits in the Americas, as well as China and India too. In these places, they opened Jesuit schools where people were taken care of as they were educated in the Catholic faith. In fact, the Jesuits are still pretty widely known as educators today. If you think of Loyola University, then maybe you know what I'm talking about. This wasn't all the Counter-Reformation borrowed from Spain, though. Another thing they decided to pick up was the Inquisition. The Inquisition was a panel or tribunal that was set up by the Church meant to combat heresy by a pseudo-judicial process. The Inquisition had been around Spain since 1478, and there it was used to convert non-Christians, specifically Muslims and Jews. And they also tried heretics and those whose religious practice was considered rebellious. Then it was instituted in Italy during the Counter-Reformation to uphold the Church's ideas and decrees regarding Protestantism. And in general, its aims were similar to those of the Spanish Inquisition. Now, both Inquisitions got a bad rap for their use of torture to, quote-unquote, prove heretical claims. And in the Italian Inquisition, even artworks were challenged if they did not meet the Church's aims. So there were big changes in the way the Catholic Church ran things, and as you can imagine, these changes resulted in changes in arts and music too. Much of the super famous art and music we've looked at so far has emphasized the religious and political aims of the West, and this era is no exception. In the Baroque era, the Catholic Church reasserted the aims of religious arts, not doing away with it like the Protestants did, but refocusing its message and purpose. In fact, the Church commissioned mass quantities of art to underline Counter-Reformation teachings, but they needed to be educational and engaging. They needed to be easy to understand, and they needed to highlight not just the grandeur of an individual, I'm thinking of Julius and Leo here, they needed to draw the viewer in to the glory of God and the glory of Catholicism. Music also needed to be easier to understand, and they almost went all the way back to the clarity and simplicity of Gregorian chant here. The best representations of these Counter-Reformation arts are found in Italy, though. This period overlaps Mannerism a little, so we'll see some of that ornate composition that was meant to show off the artist's skill. But the arts of Italy now seek to really show off the Church's new agenda, too. The word Baroque, incidentally, was originally meant to be an insult. The Portuguese buraco means imperfect pearl, so it's something that's beautiful but off balance and sometimes off-putting. Regardless, artists in Italy are using new techniques and skills to make the Church relatable and engage the audience in an instructive and realistic way. Here and elsewhere in Baroque arts, we'll see artists composing pieces that incorporate an invisible complement, or something that's unseen as part of the action. In a way, it makes it seem as though we're interrupting something, or like we've walked right into the middle of a scene. And this is just one of the effects that's meant to engage the viewer and get them caught up in the moment. Gian Lorenzo Bernini's sculpture achieves these aims, and he was also commissioned for many church architectural works during the Counter-Reformation. Likewise, Michelangelo Merci or Caravaggio shows off a new realism, and he heightens the drama in his works by incorporating tenebrism, or extreme dramatic light and darks. And Artemisia Gentileschi is another painter who shows off the Church's aims, but she does so while illuminating something of the female experience. So Bernini was the son of a Florentine sculptor, and he was very talented at an early age. He was outgoing and eager. He got his first commission at the age of 23, and for many, he's thought to have permanently changed the face of Rome. Where Michelangelo had a quiet, still intensity, Bernini has an active, tumultuous intensity, and this shows through his creation of fountains, palaces, and churches, as well as his dynamic and energetic sculptures. Here we're looking at Bernini's David. This life-size marble sculpture is conveying the same subject matter as Michelangelo and Donatello's David, but here we see a very different narrative moment. Those other Davids were somewhat relaxed. We saw them before and after the famous battle with Goliath. But Bernini's David seems to personify energy with its intense movement, the dramatic use of diagonals, and the light and dark tones created with the use of drapery and composition. Plus, this work incorporates that invisible complement. It assumes the presence of Goliath, expanding the space and involving the viewer in the action. Then there's another Counter-Reformation artist, Caravaggio. Caravaggio had a propensity for violence, and he liked to live on the edge. In fact, he was eventually charged with murder because he killed a man in an argument over a tennis match. With this, he was forced into exile, fleeing to Naples and Malta, and there he was eventually killed by a fever after he was wounded in a violent quarrel in a sleazy inn. But while in Rome, his style was unmatched, and it too sought to satisfy Counter-Reformation aims. His work is brutal, pessimistic, emotional, psychological, much like himself, and he painted oil directly on canvas with no preliminary drawings, living on the edge, even in his composition. Caravaggio studied real people rather than using models, and his work incorporated the invisible complement, as well as tenebrism, or that dramatic use of light and dark, to heighten the intensity and drama of his works. We can see all of this at work in his Calling of St. Matthew. Here, Matthew and others are distracted in the middle of counting their money. They almost miss the mysterious stranger entering the room. The diagonal line from the light in the door directs the action in this piece, drawing us to the central figures and then back again to consider who the stranger is for ourselves. Can you tell who it is? What clues do you get from Caravaggio? That's right, it's Jesus. Often referred to as the light and the way, he seems to be the light source in this room as he illuminates the way, or the doorway anyway. There's that tenebrism that seems to cut the room in half too, following along Jesus' hand that seems to point in a manner similar to God's hand in the creation of Adam. And finally, how does this piece make religion more relatable? Where are these people at? What are they wearing? How do their expressions mirror those of the average person if he or she were called on by Jesus? And last but not least, in Italy, we'll also find Artemisia Gentileschi, and though she was not as well respected as these other guys, she made a significant contribution to art in her time. Her work, you'll notice, often features women, as female artists were actually forbidden to use male models at this time. But there's a good chance that there's more to her female protagonist than just an adherence to societal norms. Artemisia had studied Caravaggio, and when she was young, her father, who was also an artist, hired a tutor named Tassi to teach her drawing and perspective. Unfortunately, her tutor raped her. But then he said he would marry her so that her reputation was not entirely sullied. When Tassi reneged, her father sued him, and the matter went to court. In court, Artemisia was tortured with thumbscrews to test her reliability, and she also had to undergo medical tests to verify that she had, in fact, lost her virginity. These indignities continued when Tassi accused her of sleeping around and claimed she was just upset because she had no skill, didn't really understand perspective. Eventually, witnesses came forward and said they'd heard Tassi bragging about what he'd done. Evidently, it wasn't the first time he'd done it either. Her case was won, but not without a cost, and in her work we see Caravaggio's influence along with the violence and drama of her own life's experiences. Here we see her work, Judith Slaying Holferness. This is actually a very popular theme in painting, but Artemisia's take is unique, to say the least. The story goes that Judith, a Jew, pretending to be a deserter, seduces Holferness, an Assyrian ruler. When they're alone, she gets him drunk and kills him and then cuts off his head. Afterward, the Assyrians have no ruler, so the Jews are able to handily defeat them and claim victory. Now, this work is clearly violent, and that violence is enhanced by the Caravaggio-esque use of tenebrism. Shocking diagonals are also created by the spurts of blood and the ferocious limbs. But what about these women? Are they demure objects of beauty we've seen in other paintings? What do you make of them? Also, what about the invisible complement here? Are we interrupting a moment? Can you imagine what might be going on outside or around this scene? And finally, is this piece relatable? Does it achieve the aims of the church to call people to action on behalf of God? In other regions, they focused less on religious art, and instead arts were used to highlight the absolute power of the rulers. Spain was just such a place, and here we see the Baroque drama and virtuosity as it's used to express the grandeur and complexity of the monarchy. Here, Philip IV, or Charles V's great-grandson, inherited his family's war debt along with the monarchy. In order to combat the image created by the ailing economy, he decided to emphasize arts in Spain. He brought in some of the greatest arts and artists from across Europe to improve his reputation and the reputation of his country. His palace housed Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights and Van Eyck's portrait of Arnolfini and his bride, but he hired great artists to create new artworks too. One of those artists was Diego Velázquez. Velázquez started his career in Philip's court, and in the end, Philip was so impressed with Velázquez's works that he made Diego his official court painter. There, in service of the court, Velázquez was able to experiment with Baroque styles. He makes good use of Baroque elements, ditching the balance of classical arts in favor of diagonals, energy, and complex composition, but this time it's meant to glorify Spain. Las Meninas, or The Maids of Honor, is a work that does just this. The piece was originally meant to be in Philip's home, and overall, it makes interesting use of color, space, and the reality of detail. It features the 5-year-old Princess Margarita and her attendants, and it shows off the elaborate dress of the Spanish court. The nun and the priest in the painting point to Catholicism in the region, and all around the room you can see Philip's vast art collection. Now you look and see. Is there tenebrism in this work? And is there an invisible complement? How is Velázquez playing with who is the real subject of this painting? Let's take a closer look at that mirror in the back, shall we? Maybe then we can see who the artist in the painting is actually painting on his canvas. Incidentally, mirrors in paintings are very often asking us to consider ourselves in the scene. Think about it. What better place to consider your own position, your own existence? And here, Velázquez involves the viewers in the experience, and the viewers in this case are the king and queen. So, are they the real subjects of this painting? And what a clever way to paint a royal portrait, no? Moreover, here Velázquez is placing himself in royal company, elevating the status of the artist. And he deserves that status too. If we look closely, especially at his brushwork on the princess's dress, we can see how he's venturing away from the highly polished Renaissance style in favor of more dynamic, painterly strokes that better reflect how the human eye perceives such details in reality. Now, literature in Spain reflected something of a critique on the era, and it was at this time that Miguel Cervantes wrote his picaresque novel Don Quixote. Picaro means rogue, so a picaresque novel is a story about a rogue adventurer surviving on his wits in a corrupt society. And in Cervantes' tale, this adventurer is Don Quixote. Furthermore, according to many, Don Quixote is the first great modern novel. It's a story that we can read, enjoy, and see ourselves in, and the storyline also reveals something of the duality in Spain in the 1600s. In this story, Alonso Quijano is an aging man. He's of minor nobility and he has some money, but more importantly, he has lots of books. And he loves to read chivalric tales of knights, maidens, and monsters. In fact, he gets so caught up in the stories that he decides to rename himself Don Quixote and set out on his own adventures. He's imagined that he needs to save maidens, battle villains and monsters, and storm castles as in the grand days gone by. He brings with him a squire, Sancho Panza, and Sancho is aware just how crazy Quixote is, but he plays along, hoping to get a big payout for helping the dude in the end. Others, however, are not so pliant, and other characters worry after Quixote's soul and shake their heads at him throughout the novel. Some mess with him and take advantage of his delusional state. Meanwhile, Sancho does a pretty good job of keeping Don Quixote safe, but he also tries to level with him and tell him the truth. Sancho knows, though, that Quixote has his heart set on something else and won't believe him. In the end, Quixote's family tricks him into coming home where they try to cure him. While back home, DQ gets old and sick. He gives up on his quest, and on his deathbed he claims he is, once again, Alonso. There he gives up on his delusions, and he profoundly states that everyone else should give up on them too. Now, there are a lot of ways to look at this story of reality versus illusion, and often they aren't very straightforward. It could be that the book is warning against the danger of leaving reality, or maybe it's telling us about the possibility of imagination. Either way, it leaves us wondering whether Don Quixote is a hero or a victim, and his fantasy world may be read like the world that Philip is trying to build with his courtly art. In the work, Quixote exclaims, quote, "I would have nobody to control me. I would be absolute. And who but I? Now, he that is absolute can do what he likes. He that can do what he likes can take his pleasure. He that can take his pleasure can be content. And he that can be content has no more desire. So the matter's over. And come what will come, I am satisfied." Who do you think he might really be addressing here? Don Quixote was popular in Spain, and eventually it was popular everywhere. It got so big that it even got its own adjective. If you've heard the word quixotic, you should know it means exceedingly idealistic, unrealistic, or impractical, and it has everything to do with Cervantes. Then, in France, like Spain, arts that aggrandized their monarch were the flavor of the era. Louis XIV was more than a little eccentric, and he took full advantage of the idea that he was divinely appointed. He was known as the Sun King, and he saw himself akin to another great figure associated with the sun, Apollo, the mythical god of justice and art. Louis was not shy about exerting his influence either, and he did this by not only establishing Catholicism as a state religion, but by also ensuring that the French nobility were loyal and obedient. He had a few interesting ways of doing this. For one, he was not ashamed to sell aristocratic positions to the highest bidder. And in other instances, he gave the nobility tax breaks to ensure their loyalty. We'll see how this leads to trouble later when we talk about the French Revolution. Not liking the limitations of his control in Paris, Louis then moved the palace and the monarchy to Versailles. Now, this is not just moving a vast royal household, but it's moving all of the French government. And the palace he had built at Versailles contained hundreds of rooms and would accommodate over 20,000 people. He required aristocrats and nobility to move out to Versailles where he could keep a closer eye on them, and around 4,000 servants also lived inside the palace to take care of everyone. For Louis, it was all about absolute control, and he didn't care if the loyalty he got was sincere or not. The name of the game was etiquette, and everyone should fawn over him. It was ultimately the surest way to get ahead in this era. Furthermore, he believed that the women of the court should consider it an honor to sleep with him, whether they were married or not, and he fathered countless illegitimate children. So, yeah, Louis XIV, fun guy. With all this in mind, the arts of Versailles and the 17th century in France do a good job of expressing Louis's aims, and they combine some of the Baroque drama and grandeur with classical order and control. All of it a sort of psychological ploy and or symbolic nudge towards Louis's excellence. Here's the outside of Versailles, and we can see a small section of the surrounding park here. Construction began on this in 1669, and the structure was designed to bolster Louis's divine right to rule by expressing order over nature. There are actually 2 miles of gardens behind the palace, and the palace itself is 3 stories, and it's split into 3 major sections. Outside, the gardens would be used for balls and feasts, and they even had animals there, so it was kind of a zoo, too. There are 50 fountains in the garden, and on the whole, it's carefully manicured, representing the same sort of classical symmetry and harmony we see in the facade of the palace, with, of course, a touch of Baroque drama. And the gardens alone took 20 years to complete. Inside, though, the Baroque style is much more evident. Here we have the Hall of Mirrors. The whole room is a symbolic concept of Louis XIV as the Sun King, and its drama is captivating and aggrandizing for sure. On one side, we see a literal wall of glass, and the light coming through the windows is amplified by the 21 mirrors on the other side. So the king would not only be able to admire and reflect himself and his majesty in this hall, but the sun would illuminate him and the room, further highlighting his legendary status. Interestingly, though, one of the most popular French authors in this period was a satirist. Moliere wrote intellectual comedies in which action and drama were meant to deflate some of the pretense and pomposity of the French aristocracy. His works use social satire, mistaken identities, sight gags, and slapstick, and in them, characters are social types that one might see all around the French court. The seducer, the miser, the hypocrite, the pretentious ladies, the would-be gentleman, etc. But in Moliere's plays, these folks all fall victim to their respective vices, and noting their flaws, Moliere points out the follies of all society, too. Moliere was appointed court entertainer by Louis XIV, but as you can imagine, he also made many enemies. His plays criticized everyone, and even got after some very powerful people in the French church and French social circles. Nonetheless, the king in his plays was always painted as a hero or a savior, so he too was doing what he needed to do to get ahead in France. One of his most famous works is Tartuffe, a tale of ego masked as piety, and the bad guy is a swindler disguised as a priest named Tartuffe. The protagonist is a bumbling nobleman named Oregon. He's only a minor nobleman, and he feels like he has something to prove. Plus, his family is spoiled rotten, and they have no respect for him. Early in the play, Oregon gets a man-crush on Tartuffe and his religious point of view. Oregon's obsession makes him look foolish to both the audience and his family, so clearly Moliere is making fun of nobility here. The family is suspicious of Tartuffe, and they don't like the priest's hold on Oregon. When they confront Oregon, however, he gets angry and punishes them by calling off his daughter's wedding and then promising her to Tartuffe instead. Well, this is the last straw for the family, and they set out to prove that Tartuffe is a fraud. The family sets up a private meeting with Oregon's wife and Tartuffe, and they spy on the two of them, catching Tartuffe trying to seduce the mistress of the house. so hardly priestly behavior. The trouble is, when the family tells Oregon about Tartuffe's misdeeds, he doesn't believe them. Instead, he gets mad again, defending Tartuffe and signing the deed to the estate over to the con man. Oregon's wife, incensed, says that she'll prove to Oregon that Tartuffe is a fraud. She'll meet with Tartuffe again, and this time Oregon will hide under the table so he can see for himself. Hijinks ensue, and when Oregon sees for himself that Tartuffe is a sleaze, he stands up to him and threatens to throw him out. Tartuffe, though, arrogantly reminds Oregon who has the deed to his estate. His good guy facade totally disappears, and he tells Oregon that he's throwing the family out instead. So yeah, Moliere is also calling out the church and their tendency to be hypocrites and greedily seduce the wealthy and seize land and money on this one. While Tartuffe is away fetching the authorities, however, a messenger arrives to save the day. The messenger informs everyone that the wise and just king has been on to Tartuffe all along, and as such the king has decreed Tartuffe an outlaw. Tartuffe returns, demanding Oregon's arrest, but when the new message is revealed, he is arrested instead, and all of this thanks to the great king. Hooray! So you see, even this work that satirizes the corruption in French society still manages to aggrandize the king, and that is perhaps the only reason why Moliere was allowed to survive the test of time. But there are other places that aren't as focused on nobility. And just like they did in the Renaissance, the Netherlands is doing things a little differently in the Baroque era too. But here, just like everywhere else, they're a bit divided. Flanders in the south is heavily influenced by the French and Spanish, so works there more often feature Catholic themes or honor nobility. Peter Paul Rubens is from this area, and he painted for the church, for the nobility, for private citizens, and for himself. In his work, he is able to depart entirely from Counter-Reformation styles, even though he's Catholic, and his pieces are Baroque in that they convey a sense of restless energy, a sense of action. See, Rubens was a bit of an adventurer, and he was more than a little sure of himself. He went on a diplomatic mission to the Spanish Netherlands, spent time as a court painter to Spanish governors, and his works convey this sense of import and exploration. He also likes female nudity, and his women have ample proportions. Their shape is called Rubenesque, and in a way they convey the self-indulgence of court life. Oh, and Rubens was also beloved by Louis XIV's grandma, Marie de Medici. So that's the South, but in Holland, Protestantism, trade, and tulips are the name of the game. And arts here are for the middle class that is interested in secular arts that feature material simplicities and pleasures of Dutch life. Popular forms are portraiture, still life, genre paintings, and landscapes, and here too, they're showing off their skills, even if it's often on a smaller scale. Here, Johannes Vermeer makes use of the invisible complement. Baroque diagonals and dramatic lighting here service domestic life. His work features a sort of inner contemplation and repose as he generally paints interior scenes with allegorical meanings. Plus, there's a light that's really bright in this stillness. It has a quality of luminescence that we see in the north, and it highlights the beauty of the seemingly mundane. Here is a map showing you the region's proximity and relation to Catholic or Protestant countries. And here is some artwork. We can see a bit of Rubens's flair for the dramatic in his Rape of the Daughters of Leucippus. This was painted for a double marriage of French and Spanish nobility, and right away you might notice those Rubenesque women. And the whole image is symbolic of physical passion. The scene being depicted here is the one wherein the sons of Zeus carry off King Leucippus's daughters, taking what they believe is their right to those beauties. We are absolutely interrupting a scene, and the action and movement are highlighted by the diagonal directional lines, as well as the wildness of the horses and the daughter's hair. And then Cupid watches over the scene, I guess, making it slightly more appropriate for a wedding. And we can see a drastically different tone in Vermeer's Woman Reading a Letter. This one, too, is capturing an intimate moment, but here it's a moment in the life of the middle class. There is a simplicity to the subject matter, but it's not without symbolic depth. Did you notice that bright, cool northern light as it creates something of a diagonal across the room? And did you notice any items that point to material success in middle-class life? Anything that points to the Netherlands as globally connected via trade? Furthermore, the portrait's size also points to its patronage. This piece is actually quite small, making it a nice accessory for a middle-class home. Now, once again, we've explored quite a bit of visual art, and we mustn't forget about music. Baroque music probably deserves its own discussion, but here we'll cover some of the basics. First, though, there are some general things to look out for. For one, Baroque music is both ordered and ornate. Here, like in the Renaissance, there is an emphasis on rhythm and melody, but there's also an interest in the development of major and minor tonality. So it's not just a mishmash of indistinguishable voices, and it's even more ordered than some of the most focused and complex Renaissance music. Furthermore, it's an age of virtuosos, so in music, like in art, they're showing off new skills and styles that were evocative and often ornate. The music for the Catholic Church, as I mentioned, was the exception here, as the Counter-Reformation called for a return to simplicity and clarity. Still, elsewhere, they're creating new styles and improving upon old ways of beautifying music, and there are more than a couple of forms that were used to make the most of this. You'll want to make a note of these so that you can identify them when you hear them, and maybe also so that you can identify them when I ask you about them on a quiz. First, there's opera, which is basically a play in which the text is sung, not spoken, and we'll talk about opera and its characteristics a little more in a moment. There's also the concerto, the cantata, the oratorio, the fugue, and the sonata. Breaking it down, the concerto is a composition that's made up of 3 parts, and it usually features a solo, standout instrument accompanied by an orchestra. The cantata is also a multi-movement work, but it's a religious work that comments on church services. An oratorio is a choral work wherein sacred texts or stories from the Bible are sung by a choir, and they're usually sung in the vernacular. So both the cantata and the oratorio are Protestant forms of music, and they have more room for innovation there. Then there's the fugue, which features musical themes passed from voice to voice or instrument to instrument. And the sonata is a short instrumental piece wherein 1 to 2 instruments gets to show off their stuff. All of these forms work to enhance listening pleasure, and often they're shooting for dramatic meanings and emotional engagement. And in this era, there are plenty of composers, singers, and musicians with great technical skill and vivid personal styles. Now, not surprisingly, this is the era where music and drama are married to make opera. The word opera is actually the plural of the Latin word opus, which simply means work, and it was born in Florence for an aristocratic audience. See, the Florentine Camerata, which was a group of thinkers and intellectuals, objected to the polyphonic style that was becoming so popular in music. They thought it made music nonsensical, and they wanted to return to something simpler, more classical. So they looked at ancient Greece, and they tried to recreate something of Greek theater. What they ended up with was opera, and in it they imitated the Greek use of monody and recitative to clarify and add emotion to their work. Monody is a single vocal line, and it's often heard as recitative, which is singing that mimics the sound of speech. Also, as they're taking their cues from ancient Greece, the first operas incorporated ancient myths and histories. In fact, the earliest surviving operatic score is called Eurydice, after the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, and Claudio Monteverdi's L'Orfeo also plays on this tale of musical mythology. Moreover, Monteverdi's work ended each scene with a powerful chorus and arias. Arias being self-contained musical pieces wherein singers can show off their skills and also enhance the emotion and the experience of opera. As a result of the Camerata's efforts, opera houses sprang up everywhere, and there were 12 opera houses in Venice alone as the musical form, with its drama and lavish stage spectacles, caught on with the Italian aristocracy. Elsewhere, virtuosity came by way of some notable composers who were not so caught up with preserving clarity and musical simplicity. Antonio Vivaldi was a Venetian composer who did wonders for the violin in Italy. Vivaldi worked closely with a girls' orphanage called Ospedale della Pietà, and there he trained the girls and women in musical skill and eventually offered Venice the first public concerts that were not hosted by a theater or by the church. The performances enhanced the reputations of the composer and his students, and likewise they raised some extra money for the orphanage too. Notably, Vivaldi pioneered the concerto grosso, which is a concerto that features both a group of soloists and an orchestra. Remember, a concerto is a composition in three parts that usually features soloists, and the three movements of a concerto are usually arranged by the speed. They go allegro, which is fast, adagio, which is slow, and then allegro again. Vivaldi's concerto uses these conventions, but he also incorporates strong orchestral contrast, giving some musical voices more importance than others. And this heightens the emotional impact of the work. Furthermore, he makes good use of the ritornello, or returning theme, to keep the work ordered and to keep the listener engaged amidst the compositional complexity. As you listen to Spring from his Four Seasons, see if you can tell how he's showing off his virtuosity and enhancing the listener experience by mimicking the sounds of nature. And listen for that ritornello, or returning theme, as well. In the end, Vivaldi composed around 600 concertos in his career, and his work with strings is a testament to the desire to evoke emotion with creativity and skill in the Baroque era. Additionally, German composer Johann Sebastian Bach is perhaps the grand poobah of the Baroque era. Bach was a devout Lutheran, and he came from a family of musicians. They were choir directors, organists, and instrument makers who saw and embraced his musical talent at an early age, and this undoubtedly helped him become a virtuoso of composition and performance. Bach was a master keyboardist, organist, violinist, and solo soprano singer. As a composer, he wrote cantatas, sonatas, fugues, concertos, and oratorios. He wrote religious and secular works, and he wrote for all occasions, including marriages, funerals, and civic celebrations. It would seem that Bach mastered nearly every musical form that was around, except opera. So yeah, he's a virtuoso. And he wasn't just a jack of all trades either. His works featured complicated musical thought. The tonal color, complex moods, and heightened energy of his works expressed something of an ordered emotionality, and his works weren't easy to play either. Many of Bach's works call for a ton of instruments, and musicians are expected to be highly skilled and capable of rich musical texture. In short, Bach's work is not for amateurs. As you listen to his toccata and fugue, see if you can pinpoint how he's doing this. His toccata features fast, complex keyboarding, and the fugues offer complex variations on a theme, all of this heightening the drama and dynamism of the work. For now, though, this is where we'll end. Overall, the Baroque era features quite a bit of drama. It's an age of virtuosos and absolutionists, and together they make some grand displays, not just on the timeline of the Western world, but in arts, literature, and music as well. Until next time.